The US-Israel war on Iran is already in its third week, and it's only escalating with each passing day. The tensions are also spilling across the Gulf as a wave of retaliatory attacks from Iran are impacting the region's key economic hubs. Moreover, Iran's allegations of false flag activity have become a prominent feature of the discourse. In a dramatic escalation, Iranian authorities have urged residents to evacuate several major ports in the UAE, including facilities in Dubai, Abu Dhabi and Fujairah. Iran's Joint Military Command says the US used ports, docks and hideouts over there to launch strikes on Iran's Karg Island without providing evidence. Listen to this.
The invading US military, after its military bases in the region were destroyed, has fired missiles at the Iranian island of Abu Musa while taking shelter in ports, docks and hideouts within cities in the UAE. We declare to the leaders of the UAE that the Islamic Republic of Iran considers it its legitimate right, in defense of its national sovereignty and territory, to strike and hit the launch points of American enemy missiles located in shipping ports, docks, and the hideouts of US forces that are taking cover in some cities of the UAE.
Now, all 6 GCC countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have faced retaliatory attacks or airspace violations by Iran and its allies. The attacks caused widespread disruption to aviation, including the temporary closure of airspace and damaged infrastructure in several Gulf nations. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that Tehran is ready to investigate the strikes on civilian areas in West Asian countries, while denying that they had struck any targets other than US bases and installations. Now, in an interview with Al Arabi Al Jadid website, Araghchi blamed the US and Israel for the attacks. The warning from Iran's Joint Military Command has raised alarm across the Gulf region, and this as these ports are not only critical to the UAE economy but also play a central role in the global trade and energy supply chains. Meanwhile, in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, air defenses continue to intercept dozens of drones. Major US military installations remain Iran's primary targets in the region. In the early hours on Sunday, explosions rang out over Bahrain's capital of Manama. Bahrain said it intercepted 125 missiles and 203 drones since the start of Iran's attacks, which have killed 2 people in the kingdom. On Thursday, the Bahraini Ministry of the Interior released a footage showing smoke billowing from an oil tanker in Muharraq, near Bahrain's international airport. An Iranian strike sparked a major fire in Muharraq Island, which is home to the country's international airport. The airport has jet fuel tanks, and other tanks in the area serve the kingdom's oil industry. While retaliatory strikes across the Gulf region has put everything on hold, Iran has repeatedly accused the United States and Israel of conducting false flag operations. Iranian authorities, including foreign ministry officials and IRGC representatives, they have issued repeated warnings that Israel, possibly assisted by the United States, may orchestrate attacks on energy infrastructure or other sensitive sites in Gulf Cooperation Council countries and subsequently attribute them to Iran. Now, following the escalated conflict between Iran and US-Israeli forces, the Strait of Hormuz is experiencing a critical and near-total closure, halting roughly 20% of global oil transit. GCC nations are also facing the impact, with oil exports paralyzed and vital supply chains severely disrupted. As the war rages on, Iranian statements have consistently maintained that their operations are confined to military objectives which are linked to Israel or the United States, with no strategic intent to target Arab states. And now joining us from Washington, D.C. is Colonel Rich Austin. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Thank you so much, sir, for making time for us and joining us on the broadcast.
Good to be with you.
So we understand that now the conflict is in its third week, and with neither side willing to back down and no clear off-ramp in sight, how much longer do you think the conflict is going to realistically drag out?
Well, it's become a war of attrition now. And so the Israeli and U.S. forces continue to strike at depth throughout Iran. And they have not actually struck much in terms of energy infrastructure. They've been striking the security infrastructure near the energy infrastructure. And that's, for instance, what happened at Kharg Island. But there's not an inexhaustible source of the precision munitions involved. And there's not an exhaustible source of targets, right? So this can go on weeks. I don't think it will go on months, because this is where the Iranian strategy plays in as well. They're trying to drive up the cost in terms of oil and shut down Straits of Hormuz, damaging and threatening other Gulf countries. Their logic, and frankly their only hope, is that they can drive the cost of oil on world markets up to the point where there's political pain for President Trump in Washington. And he's got elections to worry about coming up in November, so that sort of sets a timeline on this as well. So I don't expect an immediate resolution, because both sides are pretty dug in. I think this will go on weeks, maybe a month or two. I don't see this dragging into summer, though.
Right, Colonel Outzen, and as you've rightly mentioned, that this has now become a war of attrition, and that is also Iran's strategy, this asymmetry of economic power. And of course, we'll have to see how long that drags out. But given the mounting economic and humanitarian toll, which is again mounting by the day, how long do you think US can sustain this and also justify this kind of a prolonged conflict in the region?
Well, there's the elections, as I referred to, and those are in November. But frankly, by summer, so June, July, we start talking about real political effects that will play out in the election if this war is still going on. We're in March now, right? Middle of March. So you got to April, May, June. That gives, I think, about a 10-week course would be my guess as the maximum length that the president would be willing to sustain this. On the other hand, there's also the voice of allies, right? So there's countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region that don't want this to continue, not just because there's an economic cost, but they really don't want to see the Iranian regime buckle entirely. I think what most people in the region would like to see is a denuclearized Iran, an Iran that is intact, but has fundamentally agreed to what it has not yet done, which is to say we will not seek nuclear weapons, period. I think if President Trump gets that shorter than 10 weeks, that'd be great. And in the meantime, the other allies are going to be increasingly making noise, both the European allies and the regional allies, saying enough is enough. Those people have suffered. And by the way, the third factor is the Iranian people themselves, many of whom oppose the Ayatollah's regime, but none of whom like being bombed in perpetuity either. You put all those factors up against the goal of denuclearization, and I think you end up with something between 2 weeks and 10 weeks.
Right, and while you've said that was one of the primary stated objectives, the denuclearization of Iran, but we also understand that now there are new narratives coming out about the diverging claims and the diverging definitions of success, perhaps for both US and Israel. And now the question is essentially who blinks first and who realistically holds the leverage to, call off this conflict. What's your reading of that, Colonel Outzen?
Well, President Trump, more so than almost any president in my memory, and that goes back to the 80s or the 70s on this, has been willing to say no to Netanyahu on certain things. I think once President Trump decides we've had enough and we've reached our war aims, he'll be able to get this to stop, because Israel, frankly, is dependent upon resupply from the United States for many munitions. They have excellent military technologies, but the minute that the United States says, that's it, we're no longer going to support the long-range attacks on Iran, we'll help you defend your own country, this will come to an end. So I think the relative leverage in in this relationship between the U.S. and Israel is with the United States. But Trump really believes, and he said that back to 2016 and before, that the threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon cannot be tolerated. And now, if he doesn't get movement on that, he will be seen as having failed in his war aims. So when he wants it to stop, it'll stop. But he has to have some reasonable chance of saying, I stopped the nuclear program. How realistic that is, we'll see in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. This is an evolving situation, and we'll have to see where it develops from here. But we also understand that United States, of course, unleashing this kind of a chaos, you have limited control as to how wide or for how long the conflict is going to stretch out. We see that the fire is already there. But what happens even after United States withdraws and says, OK, enough, we've had enough, and this is where we withdraw? But what comes next to Iran? Do you think United States or Israel will have any sort of a role to play post that? Or is that still too soon to speculate on that front, Colonel Outzen?
Well, I think the region is reacting in some interesting ways. So in Iran, there are some people, opponents of the Ayatollah's regime, that were glad to see some strikes. But even those people from the Iranians that I talked to are not happy that this is going on as long as it is. The longer the war goes on, the less people in Iran will be willing to listen, I think, to the United States or Israel about what should come next. even when we look at the Sunni countries in the region, many of them are looking at this as a sort of irresponsible or at least uncontrolled exercise in power. I take the other view. I think that the Iranian nuclear program had to be stopped, so I support President Trump's view. However, in the region, a lot of countries, and I think you look at Egypt, you look at Kingdom Saudi Arabia, you look at Turkey, are looking at this and saying, we have to have a regional security architecture that does not depend on the United States and on Israel, because they will hit whoever they want to hit whenever they want to hit them. So these dynamics. What happens in a destabilized Iran? Is there a new regime or a shrunken arc of resistance, axis of resistance? What happens with the Sunni countries, and how interested the United States stays in this region? Those are all unknowns at this point. But what's for sure is that this is going to be an epoch-making exercise in power. The old paradigm of Iran and its axis of resistance doing whatever it wanted in the region, and the United States and Israel biding time and threatening but doing nothing, that's done. And we'll see what comes next. But the regional actors, especially the Sunnis, I think are going to be having an increasing role in what happens from here in terms of the security situation.
Right, of course, Colonel Outzen, we'll have to wait and see how, that plays out. And of course, there are a lot of variables which still have to fall in place for us to understand in which direction this conflict is headed. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you.